Hi, this is Rich Pirog. I'm director of the Center for Regional Food Systems at MSU. I would ask if you have any, can I just do a quick ask here as far as audio quality? Can you hear me okay?
Yep, we can hear you just fine.
Okay, great. So we welcome to this webinar, the Delivering More Than Food, Understanding and Operationalizing Racial Equity in Food Hubs. This webinar is going to provide an overview of findings from a new Center for Regional Food Systems report, whose cover page you see on this slide. The report is now available. I'm going to be sharing the link for the report in the chat pod, the Q&A box shortly. In addition to the overview from the two lead analysts for this project, you're also going to hear comments from 4 food system leaders, 2 who lead food hubs, and 2 MSU-based researchers and scholars who served on the research team for this report. This webinar is sponsored by the MSU Center for Regional Food Systems in cooperation with the National Racial Equity in the Food System Work Group. The report itself was developed through the Center for Regional Food Systems. We'll go to the next slide. Before introducing our co-presenters, I want to recognize all of the authors for this publication, and also to provide more context of why we did this report and why we're doing this webinar. So Sarah Rodman Alvarez and Roxana Rodriguez, who I'm going to introduce in just a moment here, were the interviewers and lead analysts for this report, and they're the ones that are going to be doing the main part of the presenting. In addition to myself, John Fisk, formerly with the Wallace Center at Winrock, Dr. Kimberly Carr at MSU, Center for Regional Food Systems and the Center for Interdisciplinarity at MSU, Dr. Phil Warsaw, Department of Community Sustainability, Noah Balacek with the Center for Regional Food Systems, and Terry Barker, who is with the Michigan Department of Agriculture and Rural Development. So let me provide the context here briefly. The Center for Regional Food Systems and the Wallace Center have been collaborating on the National Food Hub Survey, and we had just completed the 2017 report. So this, I'm looking back 2 years ago. And we, as we completed that report, we had gotten some feedback that the report didn't shed much light on how food hubs were operationalizing equity principles in their operations. The little we could tell from the 2017 survey results was that racial equity was a lower priority than most of the other non-financial goals. So the Center and Wallace gathered a team of BIPOC food hub managers and food system scholars from around the country back in the fall of 2018. And from the discussions that ensued, it was clear that a quantitative survey was not going to shed enough light on how food hubs framed and operationalized racial equity. And those conversations was the birth of this report, and hence this webinar. The center has already worked with one of the lead authors, Sarah Rodman Alvarez, on the National Environmental Scan on Racial Equity Metrics in the Food Systems. We developed a research team to work along with Sarah, who brought on Roxana, who I'll introduce in a moment. And here we are over a year later with the final report and this webinar. So to get things going here, what we're going to do first is hear an overview of the findings of the report from Sarah and Roxana, and then we're going to hear from 4 discussants. Let me introduce Sarah and Roxana, and I'll want to tell folks that we will be asking you to put questions in the Q&A pod. We're not going to take questions from either Sarah and Roxana or the discussants until after the discussants finish their comments. So we'll start with Sarah here. Sarah is a researcher, writer, and strategist with extensive experience working at the intersection of well-being and social justice. Much of her work has been dedicated in pushing for progress in systems of food and agriculture in the U.S., Currently, she directs the Randall Lewis Center for Wellbeing and Research at the University of Laverne, which is in California, and she is from and lives in Los Angeles. And also going to introduce Roxana. Roxana Rodriguez is currently pursuing her master's in public health in the field of health and social behavior at University of California, Berkeley. Her work and research interests lie at the intersection of food equity, independent food systems, and adverse health outcomes that are rooted in systems of oppression. Born and raised in Northeast Los Angeles, Roxana is currently finding new ways to find home in the Bay Area. So with that, I'm going to start with the first slide here and ask Sarah to unmute herself, and we'll begin.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Rich. It's my honor to be with you today. As Rich said, my name is Sarah Rodman Alvarez, and I was one of the authors and interviewers for this project. And I'm joined today for this portion of the webinar by my colleague, Roxana Rodriguez, who you'll hear from in just a moment. We want to start out today by actually acknowledging the context in which we're working. So the Delivering More Than Food report explores the intersection of food systems and racial justice. COVID-19 has shown a spotlight on the relationship between public health, the food system, and equity. For example, work circumstances and labor policies are an important risk factor for COVID-19. Many essential workers who continue to work outside the home are in food and ag sectors, and many of those workers are BIPOC. As another example, rampant outbreaks in US meatpacking plants have resulted in thousands of sick workers and dozens of deaths. The majority of meatpacking plants workers are BIPOC, and about half of them are immigrants. So Roxana, if you want to say a little more about context.
Hi everyone, it's a pleasure to be here with all of you today. Thank you for the introduction, Rich. I'm Roxana, and also want to elaborate on the context that we're in. We really wanted to acknowledge the recent police murders of George Floyd, Tony McVeigh, Nina Pop, and countless others who come before them. And they're especially devastating to our communities and have really made louder the demand for racial justice. Racism is embedded into our society and is a part of our institutions, systems, and structures that claim to protect, yet often fall short. And food systems work, and for the purpose of today, food hubs can also be embedded in these systems. And so if we truly want to reject these racist, systemic, and structural underpinnings of the context and the world we live in, we have to be critical about how this can show up here. And so we realize that this call to action might be new for some folks, and others have been doing this work for a really long time. But regardless of where you are and where you find yourself, we invite you to take a further look at this report, a further look at this work, and continue looking into how you can operationalize racial equity work in the various communities that you're a part of. So with that, we're going to get into it. We're going to go over briefly the background, some of the methods, and then we'll speak on like key findings and next steps. So next slide.
Okay, so this project was deeply informed by conversations with the group of advisors that Rich mentioned previously, who were 9 food hub managers, scholars, and educators of color, in addition to very important key conversations with Tamara Jones. So that group that I mentioned in 2018 made clear the need to go beyond the National Quantitative Food Hub Survey to better understand how food hubs are engaging with racial equity work. And from those conversations with these key advisors, the following initial research questions were identified. So very briefly, how are food hubs making a difference in racial equity? Is racial equity an institutionalized priority for food hub work? What are the perceived barriers to prioritizing racial equity? In what ways is racial equity operationalized to policies, programs, and procurement? And which arenas are robust in terms of racial equity work and which are not? Next slide. So we made many changes to this project as it progressed. These changes were based on feedback, both quiet and loud, from the participants we interviewed. We decided early on that this project would be more aligned with our values and our own imperfect striving for racially equitable practices if we let ourselves be redirected when needed. A few months into the work, we began to see this project as having 2 narratives sort of running parallel. The first was the findings of the answers to our original questions that you just saw. The other was about the project itself. So the feedback we received, where we had to pivot, what we felt positive about, and what we would do differently next time. For example, based on feedback from that advisory group we've mentioned, we added a second interviewer, which is how we got to work with the wonderful Roxana Rodriguez. From how the early interviews went, we really scrapped our original interview guide, though we still made sure to touch on certain important topics in each interview. We felt our original guide it felt evaluative and it felt controlling of the narrative of our interviewees. So we made it much more open. In doing so, we sacrificed the comparability of interviews for authenticity and richer data. And with the help of Kimberly Carr, who you'll hear from today, who's a co-author, we came to understand our adjusted approach as more aligned with narrative ethics, which recognizes that people are the authors of their own life stories, and that ethics can and should be derived from individual stories, like nuanced descriptions of how a person characterizes their identity, rather than our preconceived principles. We also increased the interview stipend from $20 to $70 based on feedback from one expert who we wanted to interview that the amount was too low. We interviewed a total of 22 participants. 14 were food hub managers and leaders. 1 participant was a funder, and 7 were academic or consultant experts on food hubs. 9 participants identified as BIPOC, while 13 identified as white. 9 participants were located in the Midwest, 4 in the Southeast, 4 in the Northeast, and 5 in the West. Five food hubs were traditional nonprofits, 4 were for-profit, 4 used a hybrid model, so some element of business and nonprofit, and 3 were either completely or partially worker-owned. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Roxana, who will delve into our findings. Next slide.
Thank you. So for this next section of our presentation, we'll be going over the main findings of what helped facilitate advancing racial equity work. This is our key takeaways from conversations with the interviewees that Sarah just described. There are specific practices and circumstances that our interviewees said either push their food hubs along a continuum of either being engaged with, to aware of, to actively operationalizing racial equity. And we're calling these practices and circumstances that encourage positive motion along that continuum forward as facilitators. And these facilitators came up in our interviews, and although they're not an exhaustive list of what can positively influence this work, we'll briefly touch on the results and the major themes from each, which you see on this slide. And next slide. We're going to start with organizational history. And this section really describes how an organization's history is a record of how both values, leadership, and action lead to its current operations. So when we interviewed folks, they referenced that the history that their organization went through explained why specific values and events came together to form part of the Food Hub's mission and ultimately their operations. And so in the report, we go into greater detail on how and why a food hub might have started in its trajectory towards racial equity work, and in addition, how the mission was created and how that changed an organization's history. And it corresponded with changes in their perceptions of racial equity work. And so here's just a quote from one of the food hub staff reflecting on the mission, that they're the kind of organizations that actually do racial equity work very intentionally. They have it in their mission, they have it in their name, they are that. And the continuation of the quote, I don't necessarily think that we deserve any money for racial equity. It's not at the heart of what we were trying to do. It might be a sometimes intentional, sometimes accidental outcome. So this quote just illustrates how folks were reflecting on their mission and the history of how that came along and how they're currently operationalizing it. Next slide. And so another theme that came up was leadership, staffing, and organizational culture. Every person that works at a food hub contributes to the overall organizational culture and carry out its mission. So staff at food hubs are really instrumental to completing day-to-day activities that keep the hub operational, and we found that hubs offer different varying levels of support to staff in all positions, regardless of organizational mobility and like leadership development. However, for staff of color who are overall underrepresented among leadership in the social sector, it's especially important to provide that kind of support for those folks. So whether food hubs are intentional about hiring, retaining, and training staff of color was reflective of their overall involvement in racial equity work. So for example, one theme we saw was around decision-making. Decisions around operationalizing racial equity often rests in the hands of like leadership, so like a board structure. The identity, the background, and beliefs of those people who sit at the decision-making table really influences the priorities made for the organization. And in the conversations that we had with folks from diverse leadership positions within food hubs, we found that the structure of leadership and commitment to the principles of racial equity influence its operation. So it really matters who's at the table at the leadership level of these organizations. Next slide. Another thing we saw was that finances were a huge theme in all of the conversations that we had. And this refers to how the extent to which an organization was financially stable in its operation. And so this varied really widely across food hubs interviewed. Some struggled to turn a profit, and others managed to expand with their given models. And we also had, as Sarah mentioned, food hubs with different legal operational methods, so nonprofit food hubs and for-profit food hubs. And each of these structures led into insights regarding to how racial equity was integrated and alongside maintaining the organization's finances. So across the board, everybody spoke about increasing costs of food production and how in order to pay more equitably across all of the supply chain, food costs would have to go up. And each organization handled food pricing differently based on its legal model. One major theme that we did want to touch on today was the idea of like the margin versus the mission. So nearly everybody touched on this idea that without sufficient revenue, either through grants or sales or a profit margin, there is not much room to carry out mission-driven work. So for some, maintaining operations was more important than tackling on or continuing racial equity work. And it often happened that the size of the business's profit margin determined the extent to which they thought about and operationalized this work. At the flip side of that, there were hubs who did see racial equity as adding value to their business, and they were able to see it work racial equity into their finances and into their metrics as an essential function that could increase profitability down the line. Next slide. Another theme that came up was interorganizational dynamics. So regardless of their level of engagement, food hubs are part of a larger network of businesses, different organizations rooted in community. And food hubs were able to collaborate with different organizations to make progress towards racial equity work. Some of these partnerships looked like efforts that would promote healthier neighborhoods or sustaining a contract with a group of BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color growers, connecting those growers to loan programs, giving some technical assistance to those folks, and offering their facilities to neighborhood groups. So this collaboration, we noticed, was either facilitated or impeded by different factors that are listed here, such as like trust, competition for funding, historical trauma related to like racial tensions, and clashes in values. So one example of one of these themes of we can look at financial gatekeeping. So some participants described several instances where funding was accumulated by larger organizations, which tended to have majority white leadership. And this created some tension because these white-led organizations then became gatekeepers of funding that funding sources that smaller nonprofit BIPOC leadership groups don't necessarily have the same access to, because white-led organizations, they themselves can like administer grants or fund new partnerships, or they're able to validate the kind of work they do using metrics that smaller grantees don't necessarily have the capacity or the ability to produce. So this is just one of the themes that came up in the report. And if you'd like to know more about them, there's these like different things listed on this slide. Next theme, or next slide. And so for meaningful engagement, we really saw that across both the supply and the demand chains, inclusion of folks of color in food hub operations was perceived along a wide spectrum. And one of the themes that did come up was that there was this theme around meaningful engagement or tokenizing engagement. So we saw that authentic relationships as defined by the interviewees really existed between like folks of color and food hubs when there was some degree of like equitable partnership established. So those partnerships are made to advance a mutually beneficial goal. And we saw this theme of meaningful engagement pop up time and time again in our interviews. And for example, while there is little attention from many food hubs and particularly nonprofit food hubs, there's specific attention from many food hubs on the demographics of who was receiving food directly. We didn't hear of many food hubs paying particular attention to the labor conditions of their institutional and corporate customers. So we really see a discrepancy here between paying attention to folks of color when they're the recipients of either like programs involved with like the food that they distribute or recipients along the supply chain, but the same attention towards folks of color was not necessarily the same when looking at labor and labor practices. Or we didn't hear about on part of the food hubs their desire to engage in fair labor practices for like cafeteria workers or restaurant workers or grocery store workers who often are like people of color. So that was just one way that folks saw that meaningful engagement could be better achieved. Next slide. And here's just a slide detailing the overview of the facilitators for advancing racial equity in food hubs. We won't stay on this one too long given the time, but you can find this in the report along with like some of the summary of these major themes and more examples. And I'll pass it over to Sarah to talk more about our theoretical lenses for the report.
Thanks so much. So this is one small project on a very mighty topic. And because of the enormity of this topic, we didn't want to oversimplify our analysis of findings. So what we did was identify multiple frameworks that feel relevant to this work to add richness to what we heard in the interviews. Basically what this means is we looked at our findings and the facilitators that Roxana mentioned through different lenses. These analytical frames are not by any means exhaustive in terms of what theories apply to racial equity work. They were based on the collective expertise and interests of our project team. Next slide. So the frames that we included, meaning we looked at our results through these frames, included food sovereignty, universalism, intersectionality, and resilience. I'm not going to go into detail here. This is, if you're interested, a good place to sort of dig around in the report. But as an example, food sovereignty holds ownership and control of all aspects of the food system as central elements of progress toward racial equity. So through a lens of food sovereignty, food hubs would make progress toward racial equity when they go beyond thinking of Black, Indigenous, and or people of color, BIPOC, as recipients of programming, as Roxana mentioned. When they go beyond thinking of BIPOC as recipients of programming and service to attempting to actually make significant shifts in control and ownership of the means of production, distribution, and financial benefit of food hub work. Next slide. So what's wonderful is the report includes suggested action steps for a variety of stakeholders in this work. There are only a few listed on the coming slides, but again, this is a great place to refer back to the report for a more comprehensive list. Next slide. So for example, if you're in a nonprofit, are you including organizations led by BIPOC as partners in grant proposals and actually share those resources in an equitable way that builds their capacity and recognition for the work? If you're a government official, can you help create new or empower an existing food policy council to have significant BIPOC membership and leadership that represents the community's population? If you're a food hub customer, can you use the power of your dollar to create demand for racially equitable practices, including fair labor practices? If you're an academic, can you make sure that when you write grants and do research outreach in communities, that you partner community-based organizations that have commensurate financial resources for that project and power in making project decisions? Next slide.
And so I can speak a little bit about the next steps for folks like funders. So for those who fund racial equity work or food hubs work, consider who is gatekeeping funds and who has power at the organizations you fund and the partners of the organizations. And for food hubs, really think about visiting with managers of other food hubs who've operationalized equity into their operations and what are they doing that you might be able to apply. We're really lucky for today. We have with us two food hub leaders who are moving the needle towards racial equity in their organizations, and we'll hear from them later. Next slide. And with that, we really want to get to the next portion of the webinar. We just want to acknowledge very quickly Tamara Jones, whose study pictured here, a racial equity implementation guide for food hubs that she led, along with Dara Cooper, Simran Noor, Elise Parks, and countless others who were key foundations for informing our work. This report and other follow-up conversations with Tamara were critical in reevaluating the scope and purpose for equity questions in the National Food Hub Survey, which is what led us to conduct this study. So with that, we want to say thank you. And our contact information is here if anybody has any other questions. Sarah, if you wanted to add anything, any closing words.
Just a quick acknowledgement also of all of the folks who participated in this project, who shared very generously of their time and spoke very candidly. So we really appreciate them.
So thank you very much, Sarah and Roxana, for that overview. And again, I would ask, because I'm providing the command control here, I was wondering if either Sarah or Roxana could put the link for the report in the Q&A box. That would be really helpful. I can't easily do it from where I'm sitting right now.
I will try to find that and make sure to link it.
Yes, thank you. Secondly, before we go on to our discussants, Sarah and Roxana are going to be available. We're going to have a few minutes after our discussants who are going to respond both to the report and also talk about how they're operationalizing equity in their hubs. But we ask, if you do have some questions that you want to answer now, put them in the Q&A box, and if you have them for Sarah and Roxana, and they'll respond. They're responding to some of the questions that have already come up. So I do want to say that the one question from Elizabeth, we currently don't have plans to translate this into Spanish, but we may be able to certainly do it with the slides. And so we'll look into seeing if we can do that as we move forward. So I want to move on now to our discussants. You see four individuals. You should see four individuals on your screen. They're going to talk about some of their work of operationalizing equity in their own hubs and any insights they've gotten from the report. They've seen a summary of the report about a week or so ago. They certainly were both engaged in the actual development of the project and the work. I'm going to introduce all four of these individuals, the two Food Hub manager leaders, and then the two MSU research team scholars. The first is Hailey Johnston. Hailey is the co-director and founder of the Common Market, a nonprofit distribution enterprise that connects communities to good food from sustainable family farms. Hailey is a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania's Wharton School of Business, currently serves as the advisory board chair of the National Farm to School Network and on the steering committee of the Castanea Fellowship. So Hailey will be the first. I'm going to actually introduce all four of them. Actually, we're just going to do it one by one. Hailey, go ahead and have you go ahead with your comments. If you would unmute.
Hey, Rich.
Okay, we're ready for you.
All right. One, I want to thank you guys for putting this together, and also affording Common Market the opportunity to participate in the development and just the dialogue around the research and the study in advance, and also the repeated acknowledgement of Dara Cooper and Tamara Jones and others who have contributed to past studies, important studies and research on this work. And also for everybody who's joining this session, because if you're here today, if you're listening to this conversation, it's because of your deep commitment to community, equity, and racial justice, and because you're doing the work that is going to affect change in society. Reviewing the study for me has been rather moving. It's been a bit like a walk through our work, brought back lots of memories of the 12 years since we launched the Common Market, and really our own journey in the development of focus on racial justice and racial justice in food systems and justice more broadly. The growth, I think, our growth in our focus on equity has been informed by the expansion of our work, and certainly our context and learning from other regions. And this learning has both informed just not just our understanding of kind of what's possible, why our work matters, and how we can affect change, but it's also reinforced and confirmed many of the challenges that we've experienced firsthand in our own community. And I think that's part of why this study is so important, is as a means of fostering dialogue, raising awareness, and bringing about practical steps towards affecting change in practice in different regions, and certainly within local and sustainable food systems. I do, something that struck me as I read through the document is, again, this definition of what a food hub, or how food hub has been defined by National Food Hub Collaboration. And then also the findings of the study or the survey conducted in 2017, and the food hubs being defined primarily in an agricultural sense, and effectively as a means of aggregating collective power of producers to participate in market opportunities that might otherwise not be accessible to them, and as a means to garner more power in the marketplace. And then, the finding that white voices now dominate the Main Street narrative around food hubs was, unfortunately something that many folks, people of color and those living in lower income communities probably didn't need a study to know. It's been our lived experience, and it certainly formed the development of our organization and our work, and certainly our approach to affecting change and racial justice in food systems. So, quickly, a few of the ways that we've been operationalizing equity really for us began from the beginning as an organization that came about from a food sovereignty perspective as a means of bringing power to our own community and the power to choose the quality of food that affects the health and well-being of us and our neighbors. From the beginning, we were focused on trying to bring about a greater balance of power and distribution of benefit and mutuality in food systems. Second, something that we've been focused on from early days has also been the notion of fostering trust and positive relationships, and thinking about our work as a means not just to bring about greater equity for our community, but also greater healing, and how we again build relationships across urban and rural divides, but support racial healing across race, religion, political party, and geography. And we see food systems, positive trade and transparent trade as a mechanism to foster some of that. Also, given where we come from, we were an organization founded by to people of color in collaboration with many others, but by a man and a woman as well. We've been focused not just on racial equity, but gender equity. And I think that if you were to look at how we have built our team, how we built out our boards, and the leadership of our organization from the beginning, it's been about we've been about building structures to bring about equity. Again, not just racial equity, but gender equity as well. And finally, our decision to expand as an organization came about in response to this observation that the food movement, or the resurgence of more just regional food systems, was beginning to have a slant toward affluent communities, and returning more of the benefit to farm communities. And we decided to expand our work at the Common Market to other regions, primarily so that people of color could have a significant play a significant role in defining the values of the reemergence of local and regional food systems at the front and center of how food systems could be reimagined and reled. And I'll part with just a quick quote from George Washington Carver that appeals to me, and it really has guided our work, and I think is a meaningful parable for equity work, which is to start where you are with what you have, make something of it, and to never be satisfied. Thank you.
Thank you, Haile. With our time, we're going to keep on moving on. I'm going to introduce Dennis. We should have a few minutes to answer a few questions, but we're trying to also answer them in the Q&A pod. We're going to introduce Dennis. I'm not sure Dennis is on video, but I know he is on audio. He is a professor emeritus of professional practice at the Milano School of International Affairs, Management and Policy, at the New School for Public Engagement, and founder and president of Corbin Hill Food Project. And Corbin Hill is a mission and values-driven social venture entering its 10th year, working with Black, brown, and historically marginalized communities to increase food access and create new pathways to ownership and wealth creation. Dennis, would you unmute yourself and share your comments?
Okay, can you hear me there? Oh,
we can hear you. Go ahead, but you got an echo, so you probably want to decrease your volume. Go ahead, Dennis.
all right, I think I have to turn off my phone.
Yep.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, and no echo. Go ahead, Dennis.
Can you hear me now?
Yes. I wonder if Luke or Gwen can reach him. Dennis, if you can just start speaking.
I'm sending him a text right now.
Okay.
Oh, you can hear me, good. Fine, thanks Rich for inviting us to, for a few comments, and to Haile being sharing this panel with me, since our organizations work very closely together. I too also want to give special kudos to Dara Cooper and to Mara Jones in their work and persistence in calling for a qualitative report. And I think that needs to be acknowledged. I will talk through thinking in terms of the report in terms of facilitators, and that advances our own racial equity work at Corbin Hill. And for that, I have to begin with our history. And that is that, 11 of us raised $750,000 in equity to create Corbin Hill. But I think the composition of that investment group is important. 72% were Black and Latinx, 64% were immigrants, and 51% were women. Part of our mission was to get food to those most in need, but we looked like a hub. Since we were aggregating our produce, in the first year we had 4 farmers, and by the time we got to our 3rd year, we had 42 farmers. We also looked like a CSA, but defined ourselves as a farm share. And I think this all had to do with the issues of racial equity. A farm share speaks to the community owning the 95-acre farm that we had bought, and a CSA speaks only of owning a share of the product that comes from that farm. So neither hubs nor CSAs were aligned with our value propositions around that time, around sovereignty, around decision-making, around shifting power, around wealth creation, and community owning its own food system. 10 years ago, that was not part of the vocabulary. So we were kind of like, you know, doing this thing, and people were listening to us and not being somewhat skeptical. We were clearly setting our own table and really defining our own selves very differently from what we saw at that time. And that required a different kind of language and assumptions, which I think is important when we start talking about racial equity. We can't really be using the same old vocabulary. So among our assumptions, and this is not all of them, it's a $42 billion industry, food industry in New York State, but we were only viewed as consumers, as opposed to saying that we were economic citizens. For us, our community are shareholders in the sense that they would hold the farm. And agency and choice was always something that we saw as a given. And then we looked at all these measures that people were giving, and measures of impact and equity needed to speak to ownership and a share of the profits rather than simply the number of jobs being created. So we were kind of raising a different set of issues at that time. And we noted that wealth creation was a seldom used concept when it came to food within our community. We created what we call a co-creation model that would define our working relationships with our community. We were not just going to be simply suppliers to the community, but rather we wanted to be their partners, in which they make and own, they make decisions and they own their own distribution sites. Our role was basically to provide the training to them and the technical support for them to be able to run their sites. Now, what has this resulted in terms of that co-creation? We now find that our partners write proposals that include us. We then work jointly on budgets and distribution models to fit their needs for the proposals that they're submitting. For instance, last week, we were in the middle of a negotiation with one of our community members, and they wanted to have a testing at the distribution site for COVID-19, which made an awful lot of sense given how the Bronx has been hit. But this is something we negotiated with them in terms of the proposal that they were getting ready to submit. I think the other thing that's really important is that we made it clear that farmers benefit from our programs, from our purchases. However, we work for our community and we are based in the community. And so in order to be able to serve our community, we use hubs and infrastructure. We learned very, very early in this game, we were not going to get any money to build any hubs. Some people were fortunate to do that. And so we are utilizing the entire infrastructure of all hubs. We call ourselves a hub that does all our ordering from other hubs. We co-created an ordering platform that's really sophisticated in the sense that it gives us access to other hubs that aggregate from some 300 to 400 farms. So this has been, again, you know, we look at this. We have a very small staff of 4 that together with our weekly box program and our shareholders, we're serving some 1,000 people a week. So that works out quite really interesting for us. But one of the things that we saw that was absolutely necessary and went through this exercise 18 months ago is if you really want to talk about equity and being equitable systems and so forth, you really have to have a theory of change piece that drives your organization and tells your organization what you're doing and what your activities are and how intentional you're going to be in terms of what you do. We have a number of steps in terms of the wealth building piece, which I would talk about. We're working with the Brooklyn Packers, which is written up in terms of we are leveraging our purchasing power to work with hubs to include Black farmers. And I have to put that into context. In New York State, we have only 139 Black farmers, according to the census, we can't find them, out of 57,000 farmers in New York State. And the net income of Black farmers in New York State is a negative $908 compared to $42,000 for white farmers. So we have a long way to go in terms of doing all of this. We're creating, in terms of the wealth piece, we're creating a Black farmers commons as we transfer the 95 acres of our land to these Black farmers. Actually, they're having their visioning session this coming weekend. And lastly, you may say so, we can't do this alone. There has to be alliances and partnerships. And we have conceptualized an ecosystem that includes Corbin Hill, where we're involved in distribution, the Black Farmers Fund that really kind of supplies the finance, Soul Fire Farm and Farm School in New York City in terms of education and training, and the Northeast Farmers of Color, NEFA, that's really doing lots when it comes to land trusts. So we're trying to create different pathways for Black farmers to succeed. And it's only in this light when we think about really moving towards being an equitable food system. We are able to do this work, and I think this is really important because of two major investments. I know the two foundations call it grants, but I have never called them grants because they were significant enough that I would say that in year 3, we got a major investment. And in year 7, we also received a second investment that has made it possible. This report really clearly speaks what I would, if you have a sense of humor, through dark glasses, as it provides a racial lens as to the roles researchers, funders, and operators of food hubs can play in creating a racially just and equitable food system. This is really a step forward, and I thank you all.
Dennis, thank you so much. And I want to tell all our participants and listeners, in the report itself, we've highlighted the Corbin Hill Food Project and the Common Market. There are short mini case studies of how both of these organizations have operationalized equity into their operations and with their partners. And it's really probably one of the key parts of the report to sort of put the frame around the actual research itself, because that's what we're heading for. We do have 2 more discussants, and these are 2 of the researchers who were on the research and review team for this project. I'm going to start with Dr. Kimberly Carr. Dr. Carr, Kimberly, is a postdoctoral research associate in 2 centers at MSU, with our Center for Regional Food Systems and also the Center for Interdisciplinarity. And Dr. Carr's interdisciplinary research is in the context of food sovereignty and racial equity in Michigan. And Kim, if you would put on your, unmute yourself, and you have the floor.
Okay, thank you, Rich, for the introduction. I'll be very brief for the sake of time. And I had a lot to say. I'll have to pack in 4 minutes, maybe I can do less than that. So my first impression of the report was to seek first to understand, then to be understood. And one of the things that came out while we were discussing the findings, or prior to that as well, was the feeling of what's right and what's wrong, especially being classically trained as a researcher. In this experience, I think all researchers learned that the technical ways that we were taught of the scientific method process of critically reviewing literature, doing semi-structured interviews and everything else would always be a benefit, but in many ways, and alternatively, in this case, that it wasn't. So what I wanted to reach out is that this report had a synergy to it, right? 1 + 1 = 3. More so that what came out, what we were discussing, and Sarah talked a little bit about it earlier in the presentation, was this idea of ethics, narrative ethics. Equity is grounded upon the principle of distributive justice, right? This reallocation of resources between different power structures. And what we saw here was narrative ethics, allowing participants to share their stories unbiasedly without the probing of academic researchers. And from there, they can draw their own conclusions. And then the values, I'm going to tell very, very briefly, the values of equity, like I said, which is grounded in distributive justice. It reveals a lot of things that we saw in the report, or how I conceptualized it, based on wealth, power, and prestige, which can go into income, education, and employment. And when you put these things in and you look through an ethical lens, the story kind of changes. So I was very impressed to see that this is a multi-frame analysis most of the time when we are, as academic researchers, we use one frame. And when you have complex issues such as race, discrimination, prejudice, or anything dealing with people, you have to use this very pluralistic, looking at different views to see or to figure a solution to a problem. So my overall impression, lastly, was the fact that ethics was at the forefront of this. Ethics is usually talked about at the end of something as an outcome, some type of violation. But here, as we journeyed through this, it was our process synergistically. So I was very happy to see that on the research end. And thank you, Rich.
Thank you, Kimberly. And just wanted to also put a note, Kimberly is the lead curator for the Center's 8th edition of the Annotated Bibliography on Structural Racism. We'll try to put a link in the Q&A pod about that. Last, but certainly not least of our discussants is Dr. Phil Warsaw. Dr. Warsaw is he's an assistant prof in the Department of Community Sustainability at Michigan State University. And when we were not in COVID-19, he was literally, 20 feet away from our offices. His research utilizes frameworks from economics and other social sciences to study environmental and food justice in the Rust Belt, which is the manufacturing part of the Midwest that has sort of seen its past its best days, but is reinventing itself. And this work is specific, that Phil does is specifically within the context of economic development and affordable housing. So Phil, if you turn on your mic and you will wrap up our discussing comments.
Great. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I first want to thank Rich and the CRFS team for putting together this webinar, as well as Sarah and Roxana for their work in conducting the research for this project and also presenting the report that you all have seen today. In reflecting on this report, I can't escape the context in which we were discussing these findings, from the global health pandemic to the ongoing movement in the streets demanding racial equity and the ways in which these movements intersect with the food system. As Sarah alluded to earlier, we know that African American Latinx individuals are more likely to catch and die from COVID in the US. As Sarah noted, this is in part due to the fact that many BIPOC have jobs in essential positions throughout the agricultural supply chain. I would also add that many of these individuals face a higher incidence of comorbidities such as high blood pressure and heart disease, which is in part linked to food environments that do not promote health, which itself is tied to systemic racism. And so for these reasons, in many ways, food hubs are well positioned to serve as a mechanism to reverse these trends, both by providing local communities of color greater control over their food environment, and also by serving as a mechanism for economic development, as there is a greater interest in local and regional supply chains as a result of COVID disrupting the national supply chains that we typically rely on. However, despite this promise, the current challenges presented by COVID-19 also highlight the limitations of racial equity work as it is presently constructed for many food hubs. Specifically, I think that the findings of this report highlight areas in which the racial equity work that is being done may not always be as resilient as we want it to be. And so I began to think about, as I reflected on this report, why might that be? And looking at the examples of hubs that have been successful, what might we take from them in terms of thinking about how to make this work more resilient in the future? And one point that I found myself dwelling on a lot is the idea of margin versus the mission, or how the centralizing motive of profit or financial viability puts constant pressure on any other objective, including racial equity, unless it's woven intentionally into the business model or into the organizing principle of food hubs. In this time of economic chaos, it can be very easy to turn the focus away from racial equity, even if unintentionally, in the name of just trying to survive. However, at this moment, the mission of racial equity, particularly within our food system, is most needed. And the impacts of this work are likely to persist long beyond the end of this current public health and economic crisis, for better or for worse. And so for me, there are three takeaways from this report that I really wanted to touch on. There are many valuable insights, of course, throughout this report, but the three that I briefly want to touch on here is first, the need to really think and engage deeply with how we are defining racial equity. And Dennis spoke about this a little bit, but one thing that stuck out to me in the findings is that there's still a significant gap in how hubs and other food organizations are utilizing metrics related to racial equity in their operations. Just last year, CRFS put out a report providing a comprehensive set of measures of racial equity that could be utilized by hubs or other institutions in order to benchmark their progress towards racial equity. And while metrics in and of themselves are not inherently good, they do, one, provide a method of accountability, but also they, as part of a conversation about what racial equity work looks like, provides a way to think about or provides a process by which we can think about an idea that is as nuanced as racial equity. By first thinking about what is the lever of change that we're trying to, or what is our theory of change as an organization. As an example, Common Market, as you will read in the report, talk a lot about economic opportunity as a lever for addressing food security. Secondly, what are the outcomes? So if we are to leverage this lever of change, what are the expected outcomes as a result? And then how do we measure it? That is, how do we know we are successful? Secondly, this definition, however we come up with this, whatever this theory of change that we have, has to come in conversation with the communities that we are seeking to serve. And this is one way of manifesting meaningful representation. Because while we can discuss broad national or statewide trends in terms of systemic racism in the food system, the ways in which this will manifest in local communities will depend on those local histories and the conditions on the ground there. And more important, this work cannot rest alone on people of color. So while there is obviously a great importance of having representation of BIPOC throughout organizations, it is incumbent on organizations to seek out those local histories and to seek out that knowledge of the communities that they're serving, independent and regardless of what their current leadership and membership structure is. Finally, for academics such as myself, well, we must also continue to do work that supports the communities that we are engaging with. In particular, when we think about the idea of utilizing these racial equity metrics or other tools of benchmark progress, we must make greater efforts to make those resources more accessible to the communities that we're serving. The meaningful work of benchmarking and tracking progress in racial equity requires a significant number of resources. And one finding in this report is that for many food hubs who are already stretched in many different directions, investing the resources necessary to utilize those tools can be difficult. And so for us as academics, we have the capacity to make these tools more accessible to the partners that we work with, and we must show greater accountability in doing so. And so what I'll end by saying is that what we've learned from history in terms of how our food system is currently constructed is that decisions that we make now are going to linger not just for the next several years, but likely for the next several decades. So it's important for us to be thinking critically now about how we can engage food hubs as an agent for change in racial equity work.
Phil, thank you very much. Thanks all of our discussants. We were ambitious in trying to do all of this in an hour, and so we're pretty close to an hour in time. We will not have time to answer. There's like 4 remaining questions, but we will just answer the first one. Try to answer the first one from. Let's see here. I see that Hailey has answered Bethany's question. We're just going to quickly see if one of you would like to respond. Perhaps Dennis or Hailey, do you have examples of food policies that have helped the BIPOC community, or have ideas that would? Okay, Luke is going to answer that question live. I see that also Sarah has a question. Is there a, let's see here. Is there, Sarah's question is there a definitive educational pathway one can take to enter this field, or lower entry position jobs to enter in advance? Either Dennis or Hailey, you want to talk about that from the standpoint of food hubs?
Yeah, I'll just quickly offer that, we had no experience in food systems or farming or anything else before getting into community food access work. And really, we literally started by planting flowers and tomatoes with kids on our block. So, the point of entry, there is basically no barrier to entry. Of course, this work has accelerated over time. I do know that there is a, from a formal educational perspective, there is a graduate program, I think at University of Vermont, or that had been at University of Vermont and is maybe migrating somewhere else, which somebody can share more information about. But I would argue that really because there are no barriers, I mean, it's really about passion and connection to your community and just finding the smallest ways to get involved.
Okay, thank you, Hailey. We are past time, and I'm noticing questions from both Julie and Gwyneth Frederick and Elizabeth. Noted these, and we will try to get back to you after the webinar with answers to those questions. I, again, want to respect everybody's time. This entire webinar will be recorded. We will be able to document these questions, so we will try to get back to you with responses for individuals. We apologize for being a little over time. The recording, the link to the actual report, and the slides will all be available to everybody that registered and all of you as participants. Also, there was a question about the racial equity metrics link in that publication. We'll include that link as well to everybody that registered and everybody on this webinar. Funding support for this comes from, in part, from the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. You can see in this slide to learn more about the Racial Equity Food Systems Group, which is coordinated in part by the Center for Regional Food Systems. You can see the link there. It'll be in the slides that you receive. And we want to just thank you for participating with us here today, and peace and health to all of you as you do this work and try to operationalize equity, not just in your food hubs that you work, that you lead or work with, but in your own organizations if you're a support organization to food hubs. So peace and health to all of you, and thank you for participating today. And with this, we will officially close the webinar.